Hello, everybody, and welcome to Steeped in Cinema, a Real Reflections podcast. This is a podcast where I take the general concept and theme of my Substack movie reviews and specialized articles and sort of turn them into these podcast discussions where we can kind of do these deep dives into certain topics and kind of compare popular films and themes and genres to what's happening in our culture and our society and the way those movies sort of reflect who we are as people. On top of talking about movies, we're also going to be mixing in some quick little discussions about tea. I like to drink tea a lot, especially when I am doing movie reviews and doing deep dives. I like to get a nice hot cup of tea or any beverage really, and hash on, talk about some movies. So before we dive into today's episode, I do have something a little special brewing, literally. Since this podcast, as I said, is about cozying up with some good movie discussions, I figured we're gonna mix in the tea. So sit down, pour yourself a cup of something, and let's do this. Today I'm going to be sipping on the Titanic Blend from Harney Sons. Okay, so this is a blend of Keemun, Assam, Ceylon, and Oolong teas. Now I got this for Christmas, and I've got to say that it comes in like the most charming little tin it has a picture of the Titanic on it. Now this is, I do prefer loose leaf, but these do come in sachets only, I think. So, I mean, that's fine. I believe they are plant-based. So for those of you concerned with the microplastics information that came out with tea bags, I believe these are plant-based sachets, so they're perfectly fine. Now, as I mentioned, it's a Titanic blend. So apparently this blend is supposed to be reminiscent of what passengers would have been served on the Titanic, sort of based on just, historical information about teas that were available, popular, and most likely to have been served on the Titanic. I don't think it's like, the exact tea. I'm not sure if we have that information or not. I don't know. But it's not claiming that it's the exact tea. It's just, it's an inspired by the era. And most likely something to what they would have been served. And if you really want to go full Captain Smith here, I say serve it with a nice little slice of lemon. I like mine with some honey. Sometimes I'll put cream in tea, but not with this particular kind of tea. I generally like cream with more of like an amaretto or a cherry flavor, but this particular cup, I'm going to be doing just some honey. It's fresh, it's nice, and it's delicious. Now, I think that this is like a Titanic-inspired tea, adds a nice little historical touch to it. Tea in history, there's something poetic about that. Just like films reflect the time periods that they're made in, tea has its own story to tell. It's a reminder that everything that we consume, whether it's tea or movies, has layers of meaning, connections to the past, and ways of shaping how we explore the present. So, if you have got your tea ready or whatever beverage of your choice is, then let's settle in. Today, my friends, we are going to be diving into one of horror's most iconic tropes, the final girl. And we're going to be talking about how she's evolved over the decades to reflect society's shifting fears and expectations. And this comes from an article, again, that is available on my Substack account, where I did do sort of a deep dive into the final girls. Here, I want to take a little more of a different approach and sort of explain the evolution of it and kind of how she herself has been a mirror to society. So let's talk about this. So why do we keep coming back to horror films? Is not just for the jump scares or creepy monsters. Horror movies reflect something deeper. They hold up a mirror to our biggest fears and anxieties. And what they show us is often more terrifying than the killers on the screen. So the final girl trope, for example, she is the last woman standing at the end of a horror movie. But have you ever noticed that her role changes depending on the era? So, you have the late 70s, we have the Laurie Strode type from Halloween, the quiet, virginal, and surviving almost by accident. Then by the time we hit the late 90s, Sidney Prescott from Scream, the final girl is self-aware, tougher, and actually fights back. These shifts are not random. What they're doing is they're reflecting what society expects of women at the time. So, the 70s, you have the final girl had to be pure to survive. By the 90s, women were expected to be strong and independent, and the final girl followed suit. Horror has always been a mirror for society's biggest fears, I think. The monsters that we see on screen aren't just randomly designed or created. They are symbols of the things that we are most afraid of at any given time in history. And those fears shift depending on what's happening in the world. My gosh, it is freezing outside. So anyways, let's break this down by decades. You have the late 60s, Night of the Living Dead. Okay, now this wasn't just about zombies. It was about the fear of social collapse, civil rights movement, Vietnam, political unrest. Okay, this all fed into the idea that society itself could fall apart. And the film's ending, well, that's just a stark reminder of racial violence in America. So then you jump to the 70s, and you've got movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So what's the fear here? Breakdown of the American dream. You've got a group of young people who head out on road trip, only to find that the promise of prosperity and safety doesn't really exist anymore. Instead, they find decay, desperation, and a crazy family that's, cannibalistic and also embodies economic ruin. 80s gave us the golden age of the slasher film. So you've got Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween sequels, the Child's Play franchise, etc., etc. But what were these films really about? Beneath the blood and body count, they were grappling with the fear of moral decay. Okay, this is an era of Reaganomics, conservative values, and a push toward family values. The killers in these films often punished young people for behaviors that society deemed, immoral, so drinking, drugs, premarital sex, etc., etc. So, think about this. You have the rules of surviving a slasher film were always the same. Don't have sex, don't drink, don't do drugs, stay pure, stay responsible, and you might just make it out alive. The final girl trope thrived in the 80s because it reinforced this idea that only the morally upright will survive. But looking back, it's clear that these films were a reaction to the fear of societal change. As the traditional values were being challenged, these films punished those who strayed from the norm. Now, the 90s brought a different type of shift. Horror films became self-aware. This is where Scream comes in, Wes Craven's meta-masterpiece. This isn't just another slasher film, okay? This was a commentary on slasher films. The characters knew the tropes, they knew the rules, the cliches, and that knowledge became their weapon. So, why the change? Is it just to try to get horror movies reinvented? Well, maybe, but not totally. The 90s were a time of media saturation, right? People were starting to become hyper aware of how much media influenced their lives. The rise of 24-hour news cycles, reality TV, and of course, the internet meant that we were constantly consuming stories, violent stories. Scream reflected a society grappling with the idea that the media shapes our fears. The killers in Scream weren't supernatural. They were real people influenced by the violent narratives that they consumed. Now here come the early 2000s. This was a turbulent time. Okay, so now you have 9/11. That completely shook the world. And suddenly, horror films became a reflection of a fear of global uncertainty and unseen threats. This is when we saw the rise of films like The Ring, Saw franchise, 28 Days Later. Okay, so let's talk about those for a minute. Well, first I need to get the warmth. There we go. So The Ring, This taps into the fear of unseen dangers in the digital age, right? We've got the cursed videotape it's spreading like a virus. Meanwhile, we've got Saw asking questions about morality and survival in a post 9/11 world. And then 28 days later, it explores societal collapse and the fear of pandemics years before that fear became a reality. These films aren't just about ghosts and gore and zombies. They were about the fears that we couldn't see, the threats lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Horror films in the 2000s reflected a world that was becoming more unpredictable, more connected, more vulnerable. So when we are looking at horror films through the decades, we are not just looking at scary stories, we are looking at a timeline of our cultural anxieties. The monsters on the screen have always been metaphors for the fears that are haunting people in real life, society in real life. In turn, if you want to know how society is viewing women at any given time, look at the horror films of that era. The final girl trope isn't just a horror movie staple. This is a reflection of changing gender roles and societal expectations for women. And what's fascinating is how this character has evolved right alongside those expectations. Okay, so as we said earlier, in the 70s and 80s, the final girl is often portrayed as this morally pure and virtuous. Laurie Strode from Halloween, she's responsible. She doesn't drink. She doesn't party. She actually takes care of the kids that she's babysitting rather than pawning them off onto someone else or trying to find ways to get rid of them so they can go and do their dirty deeds. Her survival feels like it's a reward for her goodness. But if you look closer, you'll see that she's also an early example of a woman taking control in a crisis. She's scared, sure, but she fights back. She uses her wits and whatever tools are available to her, the knitting needle or the knife or a coat hanger, etc., etc. This early version of the final girl still a lot. What, kitties? What? Well, you're the final girl in everything. Yes, you are. Okay. That's my cat, Magenta. She wanted to voice her opinion on the final girl trope. Anyway, as I was saying, this early version of the final girl, it aligns with what traditional ideas of femininity are, caring, responsible, morally upright. But she's already starting to push back against the idea that women are just helpless victims in horror films. So then by the 90s, the final girl wasn't just surviving now. Now she was aware of the rules and actively breaking them. Sidney Prescott in Scream is always the perfect example of this because she knows the horror tropes and she uses that knowledge to outsmart the killers. She's tough, she's resourceful, and she is not afraid to take control. Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street is another great example. She does not sit and wait for Freddy Krueger to come to her. She actively researches who he is. She gets information from the parents. She sets traps. She learns how to defend herself. She learns the rules of his game and then takes the play to him. This shift it reflects the change in how society views women. In the 90s, women were now expected to be more independent and self-sufficient. They were entering the workforce in greater numbers, and those shifts were showing up on screen. The final girl wasn't just a reactive situation anymore. Now she was proactive and empowered. Fast forward to the 2000s and to today, the final girl has become even more complex. So today's final girls, they're not just fighting off killers. They are confronting their own inner trauma. So look at films like The Babadook and Midsommar. These aren't just stories of survival. I mean, of course, on the surface, yes, but they're also stories of women that are grappling with grief, loss, and mental health situations. These films reflect a more nuanced view of a woman's experiences. Survival isn't just about defeating the monster. It's about acknowledging pain, confronting trauma, and finding strength in vulnerability. The final girl has now become a symbol of resilience, healing, transformation. And what's fascinating about the final girl is that she's never static. She's changing with the times, reflecting the evolving roles of women in society. From, the virtuous survivor from the 70s to what we have now, the trauma survivor of today, the final girl continues to evolve. And, who knows what the next step for her is going to be. So food for thought, this is, I like to throw in some new perspectives, unique things. I mean, a lot of times when you're dealing with reviews and discussions, you hear a lot of the same information kind of repeated and recycled, just told in different ways, obviously. But, so I like to kind of throw out some unique perspectives for people to give them something new to listen to in my articles and on here. So this, we don't really discuss this angle here on the final girl, and it's just something that I've thought about while I sit here and sip my comfort drink. And that is, what if the final girl is really a stand-in for the audience itself? So just think about this. I mean, yes, of course, the survivor aspect is always from the point of view of the viewer, but think about it more so with the final girl, and in horror films mostly, the final girl is the character who observes the horror unfolding and tries to make sense of it. She's the one who's always watching the situation, piecing things together, trying to understand who the killer is, what the monster's doing, and how she's going to survive the situation. Sound familiar? That is exactly what we, the audience, are doing as we watch the movie. The final girl functions as our point of identification in the story. She is the one who feels the fear. She's the one who is confused, doubting everything, just as we're doing as we watch the movie. I mean, think about how many times you're like, don't go in that room, or, oh, I bet it's this person. Oh, I wouldn't trust that person. You're making all these comments as you're watching the film. So the final girl, we're trying to make sense of what's happening just as she is. We're scanning for clues just as she is, wondering who's going to make it out alive, who our suspects are, who are we trusting right from especially when you watch a Scream film. How many of us, when you put in a new Scream film and you're just immediately judging every single character in, oh, they're not trustworthy, wouldn't trust them, that's obvious, they're the killer. You do it the whole time. So the final girl isn't just surviving the horror, she is confronting it head on. And by the time we reach the end, she has come out the other side changed. Same with the viewers. We have taken that journey with her. We have confronted the fear of the monsters with her. We have experienced the catharsis, and perhaps, we have learned something about resilience, survival, ourselves, or any situation maybe along the way. So maybe you don't look at horror so much that deep, but maybe after you watch it, you've learned how to, hey, I wouldn't have done that, or I've been playing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre video game on PS5, and it's frightening to know that, like, no matter what strategy I implement, that 98% of the time I would not survive that scenario. But this is just what I'm saying. We always put ourselves in that position, and what would we do? How would we solve it? Would we survive? We take that journey with the final girl. So ultimately, the final girl trope works because it taps into a fundamental human experience. We all want to believe that we're capable of surviving the worst. We all want to believe that we can confront monsters in our lives and come out stronger. We all want to believe in the reward and injustice of doing good and being good, and that's the point. The final girl isn't just the last one standing. She is us, navigating fear, chaos, and uncertainty, and finding a way to endure against unspeakable circumstances. So here's a question for you ghoulies out there. Which final girl do you identify with the most, and why? Is it Laurie Strode? The virtuous one who keeps fighting no matter what life throws at her? Or are you more of a Sidney Prescott who refuses to let the trauma define her? Or maybe it's someone more modern like Dani from Midsommar, who's finding strength and breaking away from toxic relationships. Either way, I would love to hear your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going because I love to chat with different perspectives and hear everyone's point of view. And horror is never really just about monsters. It's also about the survivors. And and also, let me know what kind of beverage you were partaking in during this little discussion on The Final Girl, because I want to know what different types of, tea blends or different types of beverages that you are cozying up to when you talk movies. So anyway, my friends, so The Final Girl, she has been with us for decades. She's been evolving right alongside our cultural fears and changing views on women throughout the decades. We started with Laurie Strode type, the innocent survivor, and we've gone to an empowered fighter to trauma survivors. She is a character that has grown more complex with each passing decade. But one thing has never changed about The Final Girl, and that is she represents resilience. She represents the power to endure, to adapt, and to overcome. And maybe that is why we keep coming back to her story, because in the end, I think we're all survivors in our own way. We have all faced our own personal fears, or some fears. We have all confronted challenges, and yet somehow we managed to find a way to keep going. And I think that The Final Girl's story is one of hope. It's a hope that we as audiences can also cling to. It's a hope that we can make it through whatever horror life throws our way. Guys, I want to thank you so much for listening to Steeped in Cinema. I hope you've enjoyed this little deep dive into the Final Girl trope and how she has evolved over the decades. And I hope that you enjoyed our little historic walk down Titanic tea lane with the Titanic Blend from Harney Sons. You can find this tea, I believe, on Amazon, and I hope you enjoy whatever hot beverage you have. Drop us a comment, let us know your thoughts and what beverages you had, and perhaps what things you would like to discuss in a future episode of Steeped in Cinema, a Real Reflections podcast.